1. Stephen Jay Gould is a fraud. Physical anthropologists have measured Samuel George Morton's skulls and found Morton's measurements to be accurate, contrary to Gould's claims that Morton fudged data to push his racist ends. This fact comes from the University of Pennsylvania and was reported in the New York Times. It is official. Gould is a fraud. 2. Franz Boas also turned out to be a fraud. Boas claimed that cranial morphology of the offspring of immigrants to the U.S. were radically different than that of their parents. This turned out to be another fraud and was also reported in the New York Times. So my belief is that the amount of fraud in anthropology goes very deep, since anthropologists tend to hold radical egalitarian views on race. 3. Mainstream science on intelligence is generally more favorable to racial hereditarians than it is to this radical environmental determinism of the egalitarians. Linked is a 1994-1997 statement signed by 52 researchers in the field of intelligence entitled Mainstream Science on Intelligence. I encourage the viewer to read it. The view is that IQ is valid and a good predictor of life outcomes. It is highly heritable within the U.S. and within groups, though the question of the origin of group differences in IQ is still undecided by the mainstream science. Obviously, I disagree with that last bit. I believe that the origin of group differences is very easy to infer, and so my position is not completely in line with mainstream science on the matter. However, it is much more in line with mainstream science than, say, Evo Gen or any of the other radical environmental determinists that make up atheist cult. This doesn't necessarily mean that I'm right. Maybe these people, Evo Gen and Hannah Barca and the Skeptical Heretic, maybe they know things that these researchers don't know. Maybe they have certain insights that are not blinded by biases or something like that. But I think the viewers have been getting a false impression that they are closer to the mainstream when they're actually not. When actually the hereditarians are closer to the mainstream. 4. Mainstream science on race. According to Katarzyna Kazitka and Goran Strakiel, those are Polish names, I have no idea how to pronounce them. According to them, of the 125 respondents in their poll of European anthropologists, 50% agreed that human races exist. Of the results, they said, quote, 3 of these factors, country of academic education, discipline, and age, were found to be significant in differentiating the replies. Respondents educated in Western Europe, physical anthropologists, and middle-aged persons reject race more frequently than respondents educated in Eastern Europe, people in other branches of science, and those from both younger and older generations. So basically, people from the flower power generation, especially in the West, have the most egalitarian views on race, right? Because they have a bunch of ridiculous views on other things, so why not race? Virtually all forensic anthropologists recognize race as valid, according to George Gill, a forensic anthropologist from the University of Wyoming. In an article debate on race from Nova.com, I think, Gill wrote something which I found to be very insightful on the matter. He said, quote, "Yes, I do see why many other physical anthropologists are able to ignore or deny the race concept. Blood factor analysis, for existence, shows many traits that cut across racial boundaries in a purely clinal fashion with very few, if any, breaks along racial boundaries. A cline is a gradient of change, such as from people with a high frequency of blue eyes, as in Scandinavia, to people with a high frequency of brown eyes, as in Africa. Morphological characteristics, however, like skin color, hair form, bone traits, eyes, and lips, tend to follow geographic boundaries coinciding often with climatic zones. This is not surprising, since the selective forces of climate are probably the primary forces in nature that have shaped human races with regards not only to skin color and hair form, but also the underlying bony structures of the nose, cheekbones, etc. For example, more prominent noses humidify air better, right? And that's kind of why black people look like more like monkeys than white people, because they've evolved in hotter climates and they need that nose to filter through the air. Anyway, as far as we know, blood factor frequencies are not shaped by these climatic factors. So serologists who work largely with blood factors will tend to see human variation as clinal and races as not a valid construct, while skeletal biologists, particularly forensic anthropologists, will see races as biologically real. The common person on the street who sees only a person's skin color, hair form, and face shape will also tend to see races as biologically real. They are not incorrect. Their perspective is just different from that of the serologists. So yes, I see truth on both sides of the race argument. 5. Some things to consider on race. Self-reported race and ethnicity corresponds with genetic cluster almost perfectly. Here's the abstract from the study: Genetic Structure, Self-Identified Race and Ethnicity, and Confounding in Case Control Association Studies. Quote, we have analyzed genetic data from 326 microsatellite markers that were typed uniformly in a large multi-ethnic population-based sample of individuals as part of a study of the genetics of hypertension. Subjects identified themselves as belonging to one of four major racial ethnic groups: white, African American, East Asian, and Hispanic, and were recruited from 15 different geographical locales within the United States and Taiwan. Genetic cluster analysis of the microsatellite markers produced four major clusters. So just looking at the data, here's four clusters, which showed near perfect correspondence with the four self-reported race categories. Of 3,632 subjects of varying race and ethnicity, only 5, which was 0.14%, showed genetic cluster membership different from their self-reported race and ethnicity. On the other hand, we detected only modest genetic differentiation between different current geographic locales within each race ethnicity group. Thus, ancient geographic ancestry, which is highly correlated with self-identified race and ethnicity as opposed to current residence, is the major determinant of genetic structure in the U.S. population. No. Implications of this genetic structure for case-controlled associations studies are discussed. Well, no duh. So anyway, even if race doesn't exist according to some constructed definition of race, self-identified race corresponds with genetic cluster group analysis almost perfectly, so much so that it would be completely valid to treat self-identified race as though it were race. Okay. Another thing to consider is the comparison between human races and dog breeds. Breeds of domesticated dogs, according to a UCLA study entitled Genome-Wide S&P and Haplotype Analysis, reveals a rich history underlying dog domestications. Domesticated dogs have 65% of their genetic variation within breeds and 35% of their genetic variation within breeds. Humans, on the other hand, have 13.5% of their genetic variation between populations and 86.5% within populations. And links to that I have. However, it's still possible that human races actually have more absolute variation between races than dogs have between breeds. And this is because humans could have so much more variation within races. Okay, and hopefully this little picture can explain it. As a percentage of total genetic variation, the between breed differences is higher between the dogs than the between race differences between the humans, but that doesn't mean that difference is higher in absolute terms. Now, this is just some calculations that I did. Dogs have a total within species variation of 0.401. Don't know what that means, but as a relative index, I'm just using it as a relative index here. So they have a within species variation of 0.401. I'm sure some geneticists know what that means, but I don't. And of that, 0.35 is between breeds. Okay, so let's multiply that, and so the between breed variation would be 0.14. Now, humans have a total within species variation of 0.776 according to that same source, and of that, 0.135 is between races. Multiply that, and the between race variation is 0.105, or 75% of that of dog breeds. And all of this is sourced, and you can add up the numbers and do it all yourself if you think I'm engaging in any hanky-panky here. I believe that my amateur analysis here was very conservative, as all I did was look at the percentage of variation within and between breeds and races, how much variation existed within each species of domesticated dogs and humans, and I used the same source for the within species variation, and I multiplied those numbers for both to come up with a relative index of genetic difference, whatever genetic difference means. But the important thing here is the relative number. That is, differences between human races are 75% of that of differences between breeds of domesticated dogs. That's what matters, not the total amount of microsatellite markers. I'm just simply making an argument from analogy in this sense. Even Louis Cavalli-Sforza, who claims that there is no such thing as race, came up with 10 major population clusters. 1. Bushmen and Pygmies. 2. Sub-Saharan Africans. 3. South Asians and North Africans. 4. Europeans. 5. East Asians. 6. Arctic peoples. 7. Native American Indians. 8. Southeast Asians. 9. Pacific Islanders. And 10. The Australian Aborigines and the Aboriginal New Guineans. But these are not races. They're not races. They're not. Don't even think that. Now, the definition of race is subjective. You can say that the degree of variation between two selected populations has to be 0.10 or 0.50, whatever microsatellite markers that is, to be different races, or any other number that you proclaim. You can proclaim any number. There is nothing objective about it. And in this way, you can define race in and out of existence. And you can say two populations have to have X number of allele frequency differences to be different races. These populations only have Y number of allele frequency differences, therefore they're not two different races. Who determines that X is the... No, you can just make it up. Okay? This is why referring to some objective genetic standard for the existence of races is retarded, and it's really kind of a rhetorical tack more than anything. But let's say that there's no such thing as race. Now, imagine you have some people with dimples and some people without dimples. Imagine that the people with dimples innately have a lower IQ, and that this is all genetically caused. And these are completely controlled environments or whatever. The gap is entirely genetically caused. Just humor me. Does the fact that the people with dimples aren't a different race mean anything to all of this? Certainly not. They still have innately lower IQs, and there is still a superficial marker that marks them as a separate population. So, whether or not they are a separate race, who cares? Think of black people like the people here with dimples. The superficial markers simply mark race and make it a social reality, as well as there being an underlying genetic difference. Okay? That's why saying that these populations we call races aren't really races can be kind of retarded, because whether or not they fit some constructed definition of race isn't really the point. Right? The point is the differences in behavior. Are they genetically caused or not between these populations? Call them races or not. Finally, I want to quote right from The Devil's Den. From Matt Cartmill of the Department of Biological Anthropology at Duke University, from a paper entitled The Status of the Race Concept in Physical Anthropology, he says, quote, "There are hereditary differences among human beings. Some of these differences have geographical correlates. Some genetic variants that produce physical or behavioral deficits occur significantly more often in some areas or in some ethnic groups than in others." Doesn't that just say it all? There are various populations that differ geographically, based on geography, and they including in behavioral differences, and it's caused by genetic differences, but they're not races. No, they're not races. He continues, "However, none of these facts provides any intellectual support for the race concept, for racial classifications, or for social hierarchies based on ethnic group membership." I have no idea what he means by social hierarchies, or you want to support social hierarchies or something. These are just kind of banshees running around in their minds, I think. But yeah, basically even population geneticists and anthropologists, practically speaking, agree that race exists. Next, let's look at IQ. First, IQ is very valid. IQ correlates with income at about 0.4 to 0.5 according to Arthur Jensen and Daniel Seligman, and according to a meta-analysis done by Hunter and Hunter in 1984, IQ is a better predictor of job performance than education level, and that education level has little to no predictive power independent of IQ. Of course, the best predictor of job performance is, get this, past job performance. Anyway, the practical validity of IQ is not something really in dispute. It's easily shown to be highly valid and a good predictor of things. 7. Test bias. The fact that average income between the races is equalized when average IQ is controlled for not only highlights the importance of IQ, but argues against IQ tests being racially biased. And that is true. When you control for IQ, the income gap between blacks and whites virtually goes away. Because if IQ tests are biased against blacks, then they are biased precisely to the degree that the rest of society is, which would be quite a coincidence. What's more believable is that neither society nor IQ tests are biased against blacks. and that IQ measures something meaningful that correlates ecologically with income in the same way a 40-yard dash time correlates ecologically with football performance. The test bias charge becomes more absurd when you know that blacks actually do better on culturally loaded tests than on tests designed to be culture fair. Blacks also do better on verbal than nonverbal portions of the tests, which is where one would expect the widest racial gaps if they were a result of cultural bias. 8. Heritability of IQ. How heritable is IQ generally? Well, let's look at the results from the Minnesota Twins reared apart study. In this study, they found various IQ correlations. Same person taking an IQ test twice, 0.87. Monozygotic or identical twins reared together, 0.86. Monozygotic twins reared apart, 0.76. Dizygotic or non-identical twins reared together, 0.55. On down the line. It's important to note that there is some random variation in score, about 0.13, in an individual taking an IQ test. So even if we had two completely identical gene sets in completely identical environments, we would only expect a correlation of about 0.87. If we divide each of the correlations by 0.87, we get a much clearer result. With monozygotic twins reared together, 0.99, and monozygotic twins reared apart, 0.87, and on down the line. For a feel of how strong these correlations are, the correlation of the height of a parent to a child is 0.47. Roughly the same as the correlation of IQ and a child, but the IQ of the parent and the IQ of the child living together. So it's about, height correlates about as strongly as IQ. So from this, I would say that IQ is 0.87 heritable genetically, or 75% to 76% genetic within the U.S. I actually think it's a little bit higher, but that's a different issue that I may or may not get into in the abridged version. It would probably be lower in the third world, because the third world has things like war a lot, famine, illiteracy, and lack of proper nutrition, and those things significantly impact IQ. Compared to this, the range of environments within the U.S. are much narrower. A 1996 statement by the American Psychological Association gave about 0.45 heritability of IQ for children, and about 0.75 during and after adolescence. A 2004 meta-analysis of reports in current directions in psychological science gave an overall estimate of around 0.85 for 18-year-olds and older, which is close to 0.87 for identical twins reared apart. So this isn't just from the APA, it's from some other organization, Current Directions in Psychological Science. They did an analysis of a bunch of twin studies, I guess, and gave a heritability of 0.85. Now, it's possible that the heritability within a group can be very high, but that the difference between groups can be a result entirely of environment. That is, you could have 100% heritability within Group A, 100% heritability within Group B, but all the difference between Group A and B is entirely a result of environment. Okay, in that way, the black-white IQ gap could be entirely a result of environment. Could be. Spoiler, I don't think this is the case, and I don't think blacks are quite in a completely separate, plant vase or whatever, but it could be the case. Just saying, putting that out there. 9, the global data. So now let's just do a survey of the global data. This is going to go really fast. The pause button is your friend, or just click on the proper link in the description. It's Race Differences in Intelligence by Richard Lynn. We'll start with the Europeans in Europe. Europeans outside of Europe, Africans in Africa, Africans in the Caribbean, Africans in the West. South Asians and Middle Easterners in South Asia and the Middle East. South Asians and Middle Easterners in the West. Southeast Asians in Southeast Asia. Southeast Asians in the West, East Asians in East Asia, East Asians outside of East Asia. While not a race, here is some data for Hispanics. Here's some data for self-identified European-African hybrid populations. So the global data paints a clear aggregate picture. 10. Controlling for socioeconomic status. What's interesting is that if you control for socioeconomic status, racial gaps in IQ will go away. Hey, guess what? If you control for the quality of car a group of people has, the income gaps will go away. There will, of course, be outliers with some people with dumpier cars who will be rich and some people with nice cars who will be poor overall. But the general trend is clear that richer people tend to have nicer cars. So give people nice cars and they'll probably get wealthier. Oh, and herp and derp. Whenever you statistically control for something, you're assuming a causal direction. If you control for IQ, income differences go away. Now, what's causing what? Maybe income is causing the lower IQs. But you can't infer that just by controlling for economics, since it could be that IQ is causing the income gaps. 11. The Asian pattern. Let's look at myopia. Myopia, or nearsightedness, is a known hereditary condition, meaning that you inherit it. Myopia is also associated with higher nonverbal IQ. People with higher nonverbal IQs are more likely to have nearsightedness, hence the stereotype of the egghead with glasses. Let me quote from a paper from the Journal of Investigative Ophthalmology and Visual Science entitled IQ and the Association with Myopia in Children. Quote, controlling for the same factors, children with higher environmental nonverbal IQ scores had significantly more myopic refractions. Quote, nonverbal IQ accounted for a greater proportion of the variance in refraction compared with books read per week. And the conclusion, quote, nonverbal IQ may be an independent risk factor of myopia, and this relationship may not be explained merely by increased reading books per week among myopes. An interesting observation is that nonverbal IQ may be a stronger risk factor for myopia compared with books read per week. The complexity of the relationship between nonverbal IQ, reading, and myopia warrant additional studies to clarify any cause-effect relationship. Now that's good conservative science. My belief is that families with a high prevalence of myopia tend to read to their kids a lot. And this could create the illusion that it is the reading that is causing the myopia, when in reality just myopic people with nearsightedness more often, tend to read to their kids more. And that the fact that nonverbal IQ is a stronger predictor of myopia than how many books you read is, to me, that supports the genetic hypothesis for this. And wouldn't you know it, myopia varies by race. From Douglas Frederick from the British Medical Journal, quote, additional evidence supporting the role of genetics in the development of myopia includes the wide variability of the prevalence of myopia in different ethnic groups. The prevalence of myopia in Asia is as high as 70 to 90%, in Europe and America 30 to 40%, and in Africa 10 to 20%. Now, of course, they're talking about different regions, and so Europe isn't all white people. Africa is just about all black people. And Asia is definitely not all East Asian people. So these are kind of proxy measurements for the racial distributions of myopia. Northeast Asians have a very high nonverbal IQ compared to Europeans, which is seen whenever the IQ scores are broken down, for example in the SAT. But the prevalence of myopia is evidence that the difference in the pattern of intelligence between Europeans and East Asians is genetic in origin. Next, from the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent Health, which was mainly a study of health for over 83,000 kids who had an average age of 16. But they also, in addition to a bunch of health questions, they also had a quick picture vocabulary test, and they looked at their GPAs. Instead of telling us the GPAs or test scores, they simply say the percentage of them that had a high GPA and the percentage of them that had a high PVT. Okay. Now first the mulattoes, the whites, and the blacks. Now, since I'm already going through this, I'll just point these out as expected. Whites at the top, mixed race in between, blacks at the bottom, right? Exactly it was as you would predict with a genetic hypothesis of racial differences. Nothing interesting there. The Asian sample, however, was interesting. And by Asian, I assume they mean East Asian. The white Asian hybrids have a percentage with high GPAs intermediate between the pure whites and Asians, and their PVT is also intermediate. Now, whites generally have higher verbal scores on standardized tests than East Asians do. And the fact that hybrids scored intermediate on this little test is evidence that, along with the prevalence of myopia, that the difference in the pattern of intelligence between East Asians and whites is of genetic origin. 13. Gene amplification. Genes get more expressed with age. The differences between men and women grow more profound with age. And IQ becomes more, not less, heritable with age. And there have been experiments done with showing that great apes can be developmentally equal or ahead of humans at very young ages. The black-white IQ gap also widens with age. This is a piece of evidence that the black-white IQ gap is genetic in origin. The section on gene amplification in the unabridged version is very large, and this is because my full argument is very complex and I don't feel very comfortable abridging it here. In it, I also explain why I think blacks are innately developmentally ahead of whites up until around age 9, but in reality are developmentally behind due to their worse environment. But by adulthood, the whites are past blacks in innate development, and the effects of poor black environment prior have basically washed out. To put it another way, as long as one's childhood isn't seriously traumatic, like being deprived of sensory stimulation outright, like in some old orphanages, a poor environment in childhood causes one to develop to their potential more slowly, but it doesn't reduce their potential. The poor black environment causes blacks to be behind whites far earlier than age 9, even though if they had equal environments, they would be ahead, as evidenced by the Tizard and Moore adoption studies. But by adulthood, the effects of the poor early environment fade out, as is seen by the increased heritability in IQ with age, right? And as seen by the age 17 results of the Minnesota transracial adoption study, where the whites started to pull away from the blacks in the study, despite them all being at adoptive families and despite them being much closer in IQ earlier on. They weren't the same, but they were closer at an earlier age. 14. The G factor. If you gave Al and Bob a vocabulary test, and Al did better on the vocabulary test, you would probably pick Al to do better on a math test, if you were to give them both a math test. It's not a certainty that Al will do better, but it's better than a coin toss. And this is because of something known as the general intelligence factor. And we all know this. There are some people who are just smarter than others. That is, if you are smarter in one topic, probably you're going to be smarter in another random topic. Now, certain subtests on IQ tests correlate with other subtests more strongly than others, right? Because, I mean, this is not always the case. Someone can be better at spelling and someone can be better at math, but usually what it is there's someone who's better at both. But there are certain subtests on the IQ tests that correlate with performance on other subtests better than others. And the subtests which best predict one's performance on other tests are the ones said to have a high general intelligence factor loading or a high G loading. So that's all G is. It's the predictive power that a subtest has in relation to the other subtest. Now, as it turns out, G is more heritable than IQ. While Bouchard and Jensen point to a claim of heritability of the G factor of 0.85, Rushton estimated a true correlation of G at 0.99 from twin studies. Now, remember the 0.87 correlation of a person taking the same test twice because of the random variation within taking a test in a single person? I think this is where that came from. That is, when looking at twins and IQ, they found that the G loading of a subtest and the gaps between twins anticorrelated at 0.86. So the lower the G loading of a subtest, the higher the gap between the identical twins was. So if you divide 0.86 by 0.87, that's 0.99 to account for the random variation in each individual scores, meaning that G is almost entirely heritable. So my opinion is that while IQ is only about 0.85 heritable, I think the general intelligence factor is 0.99 heritable within the U.S., and that 1% away from 100% that it is not due to environment, but due to some imperfection in measuring G. And in this way, the high impact environment can have on overall IQ masks the underlying genetic nature of what I would call true intelligence. So G stands for general intelligence, but it might as well stand for genetic. The punchline here: the U.S. black-white gap in IQ is highest on the most G-loaded subtests. In fact, the correlation is about 0.81 divided by, and you divide that by 0.87 gets us to 0.93. Square that, and that's 86%. So from the G factor alone, we can assume that 86% of the black-white IQ gap is genetic. If the egalitarian hypothesis was true, the black-white IQ gaps would be highest on the lowest, on the least G-loaded subtests. But I think that the black-white IQ gap is closer to 100% genetic in a more roundabout way. And I explain why I think that in my unabridged video, but I'm not going to explain it here because I want to keep it short. 15. Regression to the mean. If you make a star racehorse a stud, his offspring will be fast, but not as fast as their star racehorse father, even if the mother was the female equivalent of the father. It's a simple biological fact that extreme traits in animals regress towards the population mean in the next generation. Animals with extreme traits tend to regress inward. A slow horse, the next generation, probably won't be as slow. A fast horse, probably not as fast. Now, this is all probabilistic. There are constantly specimens popping out from the mean, becoming extreme entities. Right? It's possible that the fast father could have an even faster son, or it's possible that the son could regress even further to the mean than would normally be expected. This is all probabilistic. Of course, not all animals regress to the same mean, right? And different breeds of horses and different breeds of dogs regress to different means. Now, black and white IQ regresses to the means. They don't regress to the same means, they regress to the racial means. The best data for this, for regression to the mean, is actually from siblings. And this is fine because we would see the same effect in siblings if regression to the mean were true. So, if the 85 black IQ is a genetically based mean, and the 100 white IQ is a genetically based mean, then we should expect the white siblings of white kids with an IQ of 120 to regress to 110, right? 120 and 100, added those together divided by 2, that's 110. So we would expect the sibling of a white kid with an IQ of 120 to regress to 110. And for a black sibling with an IQ of 120, we would expect that other sibling to regress to about 102 or 103, halfway between 120 and 85. And according to the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, where they gave a bunch of kids an AFQT, which is military IQ test, that's exactly what we see. And we see it in every IQ brackets by racial breakdown. This is another reason why I think the black-white IQ gap within the U.S. is virtually entirely genetic. Okay? And it's a reason to view human races like breeds of an animal, even if they don't conform to some constructed definition of race. Brain size. First off, brain size matters. Brain size correlates with IQ at 0.41 within women and 0.38 within men. For a visceral understanding of how strong this correlation is, total arm muscle and arm strength correlates at roughly 0.23. The correlation is higher between brain size and IQ with MRIs. Cranial capacity, as inferred from external head measurements, usually only correlates with IQ at about 0.2. It's different from study, but about 0.2 is how cranial capacity, as inferred from external measurements, correlates with IQ. Guess what? The races differ by brain size. Here are some data. The pause button is your friend, so go check out the sources if you want to know more. But wait a minute. female brains are smaller than male brains. So this is really the only hitch in this piece of evidence for the racial hereditarian case. In fact, the black male brain is larger than the white female brain, but black male IQ is lower. How can this be? Maybe it's environment. Well, there's a few things to consider. One, males do have overall higher IQs. However, their higher IQ is all in visual spatial things. And it has been hypothesized that visual spatial intelligence requires more brain mass. And two, female brains have are more compact with more densely packed neurons. Females also tend to have faster perceptual processing speed, and I think this has to do with the more densely packed neurons having less distance to fire the electricity to travel. But that's just a theory that I kind of pulled out of my butt, so don't mind that. So both of these factors can explain the higher IQ than systematically expected from the smaller brains of females of all races that we would predict based on male brain size and IQ. So with that, with the female conundrum unconundrumed, we can look at the aggregate differences between the races and brain size as another piece of evidence that these gaps are innate. 17. Controlled environment studies. The Abecedarian project is commonly cited as a study that can raise IQ. Here's the data on that project. The average adoptive age of infants in the study was 4.4 months. At 6 months, their baby IQ was 6 points higher than that of the control group that was not put into the Abecedarian Project Early Intervention Program, which was very intensive. You should go read about it. They were doing like 8 hours a day or something at a very young age. Okay, it was really intense. Now, by age 15, the control group IQ was 4 points high, or excuse me, the experimental group was 4 points higher than that of the control group. Okay, now, given some of the fuzziness of going from a 6-month-old baby IQ to an age 15 IQ, which is closer to, real adult IQ, basically we can say that the experimental group was higher right from the start and basically remained that way throughout the entire project. Ironically, this actually invalidates the egalitarian theory of the widening black-white IQ gap being a result of compounding environmental effects, as the environmental advantage of the Abecedarian Project group, experimental group didn't seem to compound at all. So this is actually serves as a piece of evidence that the widening black-white IQ gap with age is genetic in origin. Moreover, if you looked at this data and you weren't told that one of these were put into an early intervention project and one of these were not put into an early intervention project, what would you think? Well, you would think that this group just had higher IQs on average and they maintained it throughout their life because they were just that way and there probably wasn't much environmental impact at all. Right? That's what you would think if you just looked at the data and were not told that there was an early intervention thing going on. Okay, Tizard. Tizard's orphanage put 4 and 5-year-old whites, mulattoes, and blacks in an orphanage. Or they didn't put them, he studied kids who were already in there. And the whites had an IQ of 103, the mulattoes had an IQ of 106, and the blacks had an IQ of 108. This confirms the hypothesis of blacks being innately developmentally ahead of whites early on, as stated previously, with mulattoes in the middle, as expected by an intermediate development arc. Willerman. The Willerman study was not an adoption study, but it followed a bunch of people, tested their IQs. It followed a bunch of whites, a bunch of mulattoes with black mothers, a bunch of mulattoes with white mothers, and some blacks. And the scores were whites 105, mulattoes with white mothers 102, mulattoes with black mothers 93, blacks 91. And as we can see, at the ages that they were studied, between ages 7 to 10, there appeared to be some environmental impact from having a white mother. That is, having a white mother raise their IQ at that age, but as we can see overall, mulattoes are still an intermediate block. 18. Stereotype threat. Stereotype threat has been created experimentally. That is, an instructor will give a test and will give these cues that say about say black racial inferiority. And the cue can be something as small as checking off your race before taking the test. That would be a small stereotype threat cue. Another cue would be saying this test is going to be used to compare the intelligence between blacks and whites. That would be a high stereotype threat cue. But anyway, when these cues are given, blacks score worse on these little tests that they give them than if no racial threat cue is given. However, the thing about all these things is that nobody has been able to raise the IQs of the low IQ groups beyond some known baseline. For example, in the Claude Steely's pilot study, the blacks actually scored at roughly what their SAT predicted, an absence of stereotype threat. And no attempts have been done to show stereotype threats effects on real high-stakes tests like the SAT. So to be fair, though, this is due to ethical considerations. The SAT correlates with IQ at 0.81, which divided by 0.87, which is what the IQ test correlates with itself, that's 0.93. So the SAT is, for the most part, a glorified IQ test. There's also been some research on unpublished stereotype threat studies done by Jelt Wichartz that suggests there is significant publication bias with stereotype threat. That is, studies which show stereotype threat depression get published, studies which show no stereotype threat effect, or worse, studies which show the opposite, that is, blacks performing higher under this kind of pressure, these things don't get published. But at a more generalizable level, just because you can create something experimentally doesn't mean it's causing these gaps in the real world. Blacks, for example, have higher self-esteem and they have a higher intellectual self-assessment than whites do. And it's also very odd, the stereotype threat thing will also be very odd since the black-white SAT gap has remained so constant for so long and is constant between countries, right? So if the gaps, like in the UK, the black-white IQ gap has been constant in the UK and in Canada, I believe. And so if the gaps were due to stereotype threat, wouldn't we expect to see a lot more variation in the black-white IQ gap between countries and over time? Right? But we don't see this. So, and for that reason, I don't think stereotype threat is very plausible. 19, the Flynn effect. The Flynn effect points out that raw scores on IQ tests have risen over time, though the black-white IQ gap hasn't necessarily shrunk, at least not very much. I say not at all, but Flynn says not. Even Flynn would agree it hasn't shrunk very much, because IQ scores are rank order. That is, your IQ score is based on your score relative to others. And so while black raw scores have gone up, so have white raw scores. Height has also gone up over time due to improvements in environment and nutrition. In fact, a woman today would be taller than a man in the year 1800. Does this mean that the male-female height gap is a result of environment? Are women shorter because they don't eat enough? Or do they not eat as much because they're shorter and smaller? Similarly, do black people have lower IQs because of the anti-intellectual black culture? Or do they have an anti-intellectual culture because of the lower IQs? Okay, chicken, egg. 20. You can't find every single gene. You can't find every single gene associated with intelligence and distribution among races. You can't find every single transitional form. Until you find every single transitional form, we're going to assume the egalitarian hypothesis that the races are all the same in the brain. I'm sorry, I got my metaphors crossed there. Now, for most people, there's a double standard here. We don't vacillate on whether the difference in intelligence between breeds of dogs is genetic in origin. Right? We don't get all philosophical about that. Moreover, when applied to animals, intelligence is recognized as being a useful and measurable thing, even if intelligence is ultimately undefinable. Like lots of things we use. Excellence, greatness, beauty, chair, car, truck, soft and hard. Now, even if you can come up with definitions of such things after thinking about it for a few minutes, or come up with some, measurement of hardness, most of us use words and ideas all of the time which we cannot define. Right? We use soft and hard, but you can't define what is hard on the spot, because our words and concepts that we use are embedded in the context of reality, and they are known through use. It's a kind of knowing that can't be explicated or even discreetly defined. So let's grow up and let's respect the subjectivity and respect the incompleteness of everything we know, like feminine or masculine. Of course, one can construct definitions after the fact, but that's all they are, just a construction. They're after the fact. They're not what really is, okay? the idea of masculine and feminine, you can construct some sort of standard for it, but that standard is not it, right? So I encourage atheist cult to graduate from this kind of juvenile scientism that they've gotten all balled up in, and to embrace the fuzziness of grown-up thinking. Only when human races comes up does intelligence become this mysterious and imperceptible fog. Only with humans do they demand that the genes be pinpointed to. We don't get all philosophical when someone says a golden retriever is smarter than a pit bull, or demand to know the specific gene associations that cause a golden retriever to be smarter than a pit bull. And how are you even defining intelligence between a golden retriever and a pit? I don't think it's valid. And so they all have this double standard, except Sophia Roon, the only person I know who is consistent. Sophia Roon will actually say that we can't infer that the intelligence gaps between breeds of dogs, or even the much larger gap between, say, a Rottweiler and a dolphin, we can't say that this is a result of genetics until we find the genes. She's of the opinion that you can't determine the genetic causation between intelligence between any two animals before you find the proper genes. So, Sophia Roon, I applaud. I applaud your consistency. Hopefully, the rest of atheist cult will follow along so that the fence-sitters can see just how stupid you all are. 21. Conclusion. Would you rather sit in a chair or a thorny bush patch? How can you even answer that question if you can't even define what a chair is? What is a chair? Does it have 4 legs, 3 legs? What is it made of? What is it used for? You say all chairs are used for sitting. Well, here's this chair that's not used for sitting. I mean, you know, that's how I view egalitarians. And to them, the racial differences in behavior will remain perpetually baffling, and their explanations for it will be constantly changing. It was economics, then it was test bias, now it's stereotype threat. Who knows what they'll come out with next? They love to call us creationists because we use junk science and have confirmation biases and a Dunning-Kruger effect, while they don't. Right? They don't. They know all about the G factor, and they all know all about gene amplification, and they know all about these adoption studies and stuff. Okay, right? We have the junk science, they don't. That's why we're like creationists. Now, I would like to compare egalitarians to creationists in a more serious way. Right? Not just saying, creationists are dumb, you're dumb. Yeah, Dunning-Kruger effect is just basically a fancy way of saying he's a dumb poopy nose. Okay? So let me compare this in a more serious way. The creationist. You can't find every single transitional fossil. Egalitarian. You can't find every gene association with intelligence. The evolutionist. Evolution is a theoretical paradigm that works the best, even if we can't find every single transitional fossil. Hereditarian. Hereditarianism is a theoretical paradigm that works the best, even though we can't find every single gene associated with intelligence. The creationist. Evolution stops at microevolution. Egalitarian. Evolution stops at the brain for the populations called races. Evolutionist. Evolution stops nowhere. Hereditarian. Evolution stops nowhere. Creationist. All races of man were created equal in the eyes of God. Egalitarian. All populations formerly known as races are essentially the same in the brain. The evolutionist. The races are just clinal variations of Homo sapiens separated by barriers to gene flow. There's no reason to assume they're equal in any way. The hereditarian. The races are just clinal variations of Homo sapiens separated by barriers to gene flow, and there's no reason to assume they're equal in any way. Creationist. Atheists just want to be hedonists and commit immoral acts. Hannibal Barca. Hereditarians are just racists who want to justify their racial hatred and inequality, and that's why they all cluster around the Mises Institute. The evolutionist. Atheists simply recognize that there is no God. No other beliefs necessarily follow. The hereditarian. Hereditarians simply recognize that race exists and are not the same, and that evolution did not stop at the neck. No other beliefs necessarily follow. Creationist. Bananas were designed by God. Egalitarian. I knew this really smart black guy once. Evolutionist. Bananas were something that humans designed through selective breeding. Hereditarian. And I knew this one guy who didn't know what an average is. Creationist. We're fighting for the righteous cause of God and Christ. Egalitarian. We're fighting for the righteous cause of equality and some other shit. Evolutionist. You're fighting for a bogus cause that has and will harm everyone. Hereditarian. You're fighting for a bogus cause that has and will harm everyone. Creationist. The Inquisition, banning books. Egalitarian. Hate speech codes, political correctness / cultural Marxism. Creationist. You're an atheist, heretic. Egalitarian. You're a racist. Evolutionist. You're an idiot and a mobber. Hereditarian. You're an idiot and a mobber.